There are two ways to create a template. Up until now, we've been creating the template inside the HTML document. We have the option of creating the template inside the Vue instance. Let's try creating the template inside the instance instead of in the document. Starting with the document, let's cut the code inside the div tag with the ID of app. We'll leave the parent element alone. It's still required to have an element on the document for Vue to start the mounting phase. Then, switching to the JavaScript file inside the configuration object, we're going to remove every lifecycle function. We're going to get rid of any commented code since we no longer need it. Templates can be directly loaded in the Vue instance by adding the template property. The value for this property must be the template Vue will compile. I'll paste in the code we cut earlier as a string literal. I'm adding this in as a string literal to take advantage of multi-line code in ES6. You can use regular quotes if you wish. Let's view this in the browser for the outcome. Refresh the page on your browser. The template is compiled and rendered onto the page. The expression interpolates into the value we had in the data. So what's the difference? Well, there's not much of a difference. They both accomplish the same thing. You may want to use the template property if the HTML is stored inside a different file. You would need to make a request to grab that file. Then you would use the response from the request as the value for the template property. That's just one scenario. Usually, I don't recommend using the template property for two main reasons. The first reason is that most editors won't be able to pick up on the HTML syntax inside a JavaScript file. Even my editor will highlight everything as a string. The second reason is that you can't do multi-line templates easily. I'm using a string literal, but string literals are not compatible with older browsers. Therefore, you'll have to use quotes and append each string together for each line. That makes things harder to manage. I always recommend storing the template inside the document and let Vue take it from there. There is another option, which is usually the preferred option for more complex applications. There are multiple versions of Vue available for download. However, all of them can be broken down into two categories. There are the versions with the compiler and the versions without the compiler. Notice how the only difference between these two types is the compiler itself. The compiler, as we learned previously, is responsible for taking in your template as a string. It'll convert the template into an object for the virtual DOM. Whenever you use the template property or the mount method, the compiler will be used. Throughout this course, we've been using the version with the compiler. Vue grabbed the contents of the element we passed into the mount method and compiled it. However, we do have the choice of using Vue without the compiler. The main advantage of using Vue without the compiler is the size reduction of the file. By removing it, Vue will be reduced to about 30% of its original size. This reduction will, in turn, increase loading times. Vue is also much faster since it doesn't have to worry about compiling your templates. The downside of using Vue without the compiler is that it's harder to read and manage without the proper tools. Fortunately, the development team behind Vue has made using Vue without the compiler simple. They have an official toolset we can leverage. This toolset gives us the performance boost of using Vue without the compiler. We'll be diving into how to use the proper tools soon enough. First, I want to take the time to explore with you the compilation process. The difference between the two versions is the compiler. Even if you use the version without the compiler, you still have access to features like directives, expressions, bindings, and events. Every feature is available to you except the part where Vue will process your template and convert it into an object. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link that describes the different versions of Vue. It's referred to as builds in the documentation. There are a number of builds here, but as I said before, it's narrowed down to two different categories, the one with the compiler and the one without the compiler. The build with the compiler is referred to as the full build. The build without the compiler is referred to as the runtime only build. For most of this course, we've been using the Vue.js build. It's the full version, meaning we've been using Vue with the compiler. For the word compiler, Vue defines it as the following: code that is responsible for compiling template strings into JavaScript render functions. What exactly are render functions? Let's look into that. In my browser, I'm going to open the Vue application we've been working with in this section. To save some time, we're going to run the examples in the console panel instead of writing the code in a file. Let's create a variable called res. The value of this will be the vue.compile function. The vue.compile function is the exact function Vue uses internally to process your template. You're required to pass in the template as a string. By default, Vue will pass in the template you select in the mount method. However, since we're calling it manually, we'll need to do that ourselves. We'll pass in some paragraph tags with some random text. For fun, I'll throw in a v-if directive with the expression set to true. We're storing the value since the compiler only compiles the template. It does not store it anywhere for us. Running this line will not do much. However, the res variable will be available, and we can call it next. The value assigned will be an object. The object will have a property called render. I'm going to log this property next. This function will return what's called a render function. It's a function that will take care of rendering the template in the document. This is the compiler in action. It takes in raw HTML as a string. It'll return a function which Vue calls a render function. The render function is responsible for returning an object that represents the template you passed in. We have the option of completely removing the compiler by using the runtime build. The only downside is that we're required to build the object ourselves and provide it to Vue. Let's learn how to do that. Let's go back to the editor. Back inside the document, we're going to create another div tag below the first one. We'll give it the ID of app2. We're going to create two applications and compare them side by side. The first one will use the compiler, and the second one we're about to create will not use the compiler. Switching to the script file, we'll create a variable called vm2. Its value will be the vue.createApp function. Then, we'll chain the mount method. The element we'll mount to is #app2. The data for this application will be the same as the first one. We'll have two applications with identical data. This example will help us see the difference. Now the question is, how do we create the object without the compiler and pass it on to Vue? We can do that by creating our own render function. The Vue instance allows us to create a render function by using the render property. Set this to a function. This property is optional, but if you provide it, then Vue will allow you to create the object yourself. Inside this function, we're required to return an object. We could create that object ourselves, or we can use the vue.h function. The vue.h function will help you create the object in the correct format. It'll also take care of filling in the blanks for us. Therefore, we'll return the vue.h function. H is short for hyperscript. When we think of HTML, we know that it means hypertext markup language. That's what it is. It's a document made up of text. Hyperscript is similar, except you're using JavaScript to create HTML. The development team behind Vue uses H instead of spelling the full name to reduce file size. This function has some parameters, but we're going to use the first two. The first parameter is the name of the element. Let's pass in an h1 element. The second parameter is the content inside the element. You can set this to a string, but I want to output the message inside the data property, just like the first application. During the render process, we have access to the proxy methods, and properties Vue sets up for us. Since that's the case, I can pass in this .message. It's not necessary to use an expression. Alright, let's give things a test. Refresh the page to view the results. We have two identical applications. The difference between them is that the first application is using the compiler. The second app is manually creating the object. We are skipping the step of compiling a template from a string. Let's see what happens if we remove the compiler from the build. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to CDN.js. CDN.js is another CDN platform. We are on a page for different links to different builds of Vue. Search for the link that says vue.runtime.global.js. This build is the version of Vue without the compiler. Its file size will be considerably smaller. We are going to copy this link. In the document, we will replace the current CDN link for Vue with the link we copied. Go ahead and refresh the page. This time, only the second application will load. What happened to the first one? Since we're using the build without the compiler, Vue will not bother compiling the template we had earlier. This will ultimately result in a broken application. This makes it very clear as to what the differences are between the two builds. The runtime build is the preferred build to use. It does have a major downside. We have to write render functions to build our templates. It isn't very appealing. It would be so much nicer if we could continue writing the template as we always have, but continue to gain the performance benefit of the runtime build. Luckily, there is such a way. We can use the Vue CLI. I'm getting a little ahead here, but I want you to be aware that there is a way to make this process easier and still gain the performance boost. I promise we'll dive into the Vue CLI later in this course. There are still a couple more things I want to discuss. So for now, I'm going to comment out the second application inside the JavaScript file. Then I'll change the script back to the full build. Lastly, we'll cut the value inside the template property from the first application back inside the document. I find this the simplest way of doing things. If you want to use the template property or the render function, then by all means, go for it. Lastly, we'll remove the second div tag. That'll do it. In the next couple of lectures, we'll begin diving into components.